My name is Hannah Stone, and so I'm sitting today as the chair of the Justice Committee alongside Council members Barker and Vargas. Joined today are also Council members Knudsen and Lilliquist. So on the agenda bill that I put in the packet for today, there wasn't a lot of information aside from a copy of the ordinance that the council passed almost 2 years ago to the day, as well as the section of the Bellingham Municipal Code that was created as a part of that ordinance. And as some of the public may or may not know, so when we have committees, there's a 3-member committee, and because 2 would make a quorum, I can't actually talk to my fellow committee members outside of the public, which, I mean, some of that's good, but it also logistically can make things difficult. So what happened at the beginning of the year is that we reshuffled the committees. And so in January, I took over as chair of the Justice Committee. And one of the things I wanted to do was to look back at the ordinance that we passed. And part of what, well, a couple of things sparked that. And one was that I'd been approached by some community members about Bellingham putting together sort of a declaration of human rights in a more formal fashion, which I'm supportive of, but I also felt like this ordinance was sort of an example of the council making some promises to the community, and before we made any more promises, wanting to go back and try and have some accountability and follow up about what we're doing or not doing and where we're at. So hopefully that makes sense. That's just a brief introduction of sort of where I'm coming from. And so I also wanted to address that when this ordinance was passed, there were community members reaching out and asking for some specific things, and there was a petition that was presented that night that was asking that there were 3 things: so that all city departments, agencies, and personnel are prohibited from and may not use any funds or resources for cooperating with or sharing information with either ICE or Border Patrol. That was 1. 2 was law enforcement may not stop, detain, question, or arrest a person based to any degree on the person's race or immigration status, and that 3 violators of the previous 2 laws will face enforcement and penalties. And so there's been questions of me as an immigration attorney to review the ordinance and to provide feedback about, did we do a good job or not? And I think the hardest part is that when we work within the law and sort of ordinances and codes, there are very rarely absolutes, which I know that the community would love for us to be able to draw a line and say, absolutely, under no circumstances would X, Y, or Z happen. And the reality is that that's just not the world that we operate in. And so one of the things I also want to ask community for is that we were making a promise that we're going to protect our residents and that we're not going to cooperate, at their detriment unless there was criminal activity or certain triggers. And so wanting to ask the community to trust that process and then call us on it when it's not working. And so with that, I wanted to first ask, I don't know if fellow council members have any questions or comments. At this point, I have some questions for the mayor and staff just as we move forward on this, but does any of that? Yeah, April.
I think one of those is one of the responses after the ordinances. There was ICE activity in the community that we know about last August. And in a meeting, I think the mayor was out of town, but Brian was here. You all may recall, I had requested that we had developed, what the community was saying is, we don't necessarily expect that you were able to stop it, right? Because we understand that, but we do want to get a rapid communication response as to what happened, and so they're not having to navigate a bunch of different sites and people. Like, what just happened from the city's perspective? Was our police department involved? And then 2, any facts that we know that happened to our community members. And so Brian at that time had agreed that he would work toward that. So that might be something we could hear back from today or in the future as it's happening. So that would be my one input.
And just to follow up, so that was a motion to put in place a rapid response?
Asking the, mayor or to work with staff to just develop a rapid response so we have a little more reliability and people know where to go to have that information.
Okay. Yeah, Pinky.
I don't have any specific questions, but I'm glad that we are reviewing this to see how we're doing and what improvements we can make. So I'll go ahead and ask your questions, and I'll see if I have any follow-up. Thank you.
Thank you. So one of the pieces, since Chief Dahl's here back from vacation, if you wouldn't mind if I could just ask, I'm not asking you to report out today, but hopefully in a future meeting, if we could have some follow-up, so to piggyback on what April was mentioning, is that I would think in response to having an ordinance like this on the books is that when there is ICE activity in our community, finding out, having transparency and accountability for the community about what happened and what the level of involvement, if any, was by our local law enforcement. And so in particular, the one instance was in August of this past year. And then if outside of that, part of the ordinance was to, there wasn't going to be a formal sort of mandated report out process every 6 months where the police department would report sort of contacts. But I think in the name of transparency and accountability, just having that, those lines of communication to sort of know if any activity is happening in the community.
Thank you. I'm David Dahl. I am your police chief. In regards to the August event, the Bellingham Police Department did not participate, nor were we asked to participate in that activity by the federal agencies. I'd also remind everyone in our community that our immigration enforcement policy is on our website, and that policy, as a result of the collaboration that we had, I think it was about a couple years ago that you spoke about, made some changes as a result of some feedback that we got from stakeholders in our community. And I always tell people, whenever we talk about the Bellingham Police Department and immigration enforcement, is that we do not enforce civil immigration law. And that my foundational interest as your police chief is to have a police department that anyone will come to for help. I don't want to disenfranchise any member of our community. I don't want any member of our community who's undocumented to feel they cannot report a crime, because that further creates victimization. That's happening right now in our country. We hear about that. So I want to do what I can do to ensure our community that if they need help, they can come to us. And part of that is by displaying that policy that we have on our website, so folks can see exactly what we will and will not do.
Is that the policy 417?
Yes.
Okay. And the adoption date I have is 1/14/2016, but you're saying that has that been updated or changed since that
I don't
time?
believe that it has been fundamentally updated until recently, when we're going through that process right now to look at the RCW that changed regarding U visas and the timelines that are established with getting those completed and processed. Okay.
Because one of the questions that I guess I would ask, if it's possible for, I don't know, the interface between the departments, but with Chief Dahl and perhaps legal, Mr. Rafato, is to look at, so there's in that policy talking about civil versus criminal federal offenses, 417.4.3, and I can provide this information, but it says, an individual who enters into the United States illegally has committed a misdemeanor, 8 U.S.C. section 325A. And generally, an alien who initially, the government's choice of words, not mine, made a legal entry into the United States but has remained beyond what is legal period of time, has committed a federal civil offense. And so what some people may not know is that within the immigration system, right, most of the U.S. Immigration Naturalization Act is also codified in the U.S. Code. And so there are civil infractions and then there are also criminal offenses that sort of mirror one another going forward. And so usually what we're saying is that if there's been criminal activity in our community and community members are not safe, then we would expect that there may be some, action on the part of our local police to keep the community safe. But when something like that, an individual entering the United States without authorization, is deemed to be a misdemeanor under the federal code, my hope is that that's not something that the local police would be enforcing. And so what I'm wondering is if there's any changes that could be made to this policy, the police department's policy, to specify that it would be criminal. Peter, you'd have to help me on the wording going forward, but that they would be basically criminal activity that's also recognized or in the state or municipal codes, right? And I see it a lot in the reverse, where when I'm analyzing criminal infractions and their impact on the, the federal immigration laws, it has to be one that would be sort of found within the U.S. code. So similarly, only acting on criminal activity that would actually be defined as a crime under our state law.
So
Does that
one
make
of the
sense?
one of the things to tell you is that we do work very closely with legal when we look especially at this particular policy. And I'm more than happy to work with legal on making sure that language clearly reflects that we will enforce criminal law. Your police officers here are not trained as federal immigration agents. We just don't have that training, nor do we want that training. Again, I want people in my community and your community to come to us when they need help. I don't want them to be worried that we're going to want to know their status here. I don't care. I do not care about someone's status, documentation as a member of this community or this country. I want them to come for help if they need help. That's my bottom line, and it always has been.
Thank you, Chief Dahl. Okay, I think that's, and I can follow up with you, Chief Dahl, if there are additional questions about the information that we want back. But Mr. Rafato, do you have other questions if we were going to move forward on?
Yeah, I think if I understand, I think that is a statement in that policy that has been there a long time that wasn't really looked at that closely. In my estimation, I suspect that has never been viewed as this idea that the actual act of crossing the border as a misdemeanor is not something that this department enforces. So the fact that's a statement of law is not, I understand where it may cause some concern, but we can work with the BPD on that. And what you're really, if I understand, it's always a challenge. It's like, okay, do we carve out specific things that we know are not of concern to this department? Do you carve it in or do you carve it out? For example, we know that there's certain things that may be crimes that they're not going to enforce, but to say we're only going to enforce things that are, like, would BPD be interested in assisting federal agencies enforcing what is a serious federal felony, for example? So it's just a challenge in trying to, again, if you don't understand what I mean by making exceptions or saying these are all that they're going to enforce, but we can work with the police department on that, and I think I understand.
Immigration law, or not?
Correct, although there are things in certain parts of that code, I think, last time the discussion was about trafficking and things like that, that are, may be part of the same federal code that we would want our department enforcing. So that's why we have to sit down and look through that.
Okay.
I have concerns about prohibiting our cooperation with federal investigations. As an example, Net Nanny, where last year we arrested 21 people who were prowling the internet to have sex with children. And these weren't just people that were prowling, they showed up. And I can't think of anything more disgusting than that we worked with our federal partners. In fact, we have training going on right now in our training room from people all across the United States and Guam to learn about these internet crimes against children, investigations that are going on, and just the victimization, the trafficking. It's horrific. So I do want to be careful about the language that we have, because there are times when we use assets, whether they be air assets or marine assets from the federal government, to help us do our work in enforcing criminal law.
Thank you. Yeah, Vargas.
Hannah, this isn't directly related to that question, but it's making me think about something that's been occurring for us, is around communication. And I think one of the challenges, the general public doesn't really understand all the different government agencies and how we're connected and who's responsible for what. So often they're looking to us as the city, as the police force, to give them clarity and around what's happening. And so they often will assume that we're all connected, and we are in some ways, but they don't federal doesn't necessarily communicate with us when they want to do something in our city. And so that's something that is not always obvious, I think, to the general public. One of the things that's been happening lately with our homeless shelter, which I think could also be applied here, is how we communicate about what our involvement is, what our responsibility is, or how we are tied to a situation. And that's been occurring in a couple different areas right now. And I was thinking about that this weekend in regards to, we do have a communications person, but often the media does not share the information that we give them to share. So that information doesn't always become public. And I think maybe one thing I would like to suggest is that we find a way to maybe up our social media communication. So when these kinds of things happen, we can put something out there that's very clearly says, because that is the way people communicate. That's where they're getting their information. And so if that's a tool that most of people are looking at right now, and I think we need to be utilizing it. So for what happened in August is maybe we know we're often doing the work that we need to do, but people don't understand what the connection is or how it relates to us. So maybe we just start clarifying when these things happen, like what happened with these arrests in August, what our involvement is or what our not involvement is or how we're doing things. So just maybe upping our social media communications for things like this, for homeless or incidents that are happening. So I just want to throw that out there, as I think that's part of the issue is communication.
Absolutely. Thanks, Miki, and I think that relates to the motion too that April had presented before about having that rapid response and tying that into communication. And one of the transitions, I want to keep us on schedule and then I'll go to you, Mayor. The transitions about what Chief Dahl was mentioning is about wanting to make sure people are coming forward. And so one of the big issues too is, a complaint system and whether or not there's a need for an ombudsman's office or not. And I know that in watching, as a new member, looking back over the meetings, having heard the mayor speak to the fact that we're going to, sort of go forward with the safe spaces and an independent third party to help field complaints and act as an advocate and liaison when there are concerns or complaints that come forward. And so one, wanting to check in on where we are about that, but also confirming that, this would be a pilot program going forward. And so if not utilized or if not meeting the need, then this is a first step and there may be more steps to be taken. But wanting to find out, sort of where we are in that process. So, Mayor, I don't know if you have a response.
I'll do the easier one first. In checking with Brian, I don't know I'll go ahead and, because after you asked me, I checked with Brian, and the RFP is in purchasing? No, let him tell you. It's in the works anyway. And there was the move and the bad weather that might have slowed down my watching over this completely, but I just wanted to say that it's my intent that happened because I was very concerned about it to begin with. So I'll let Brian give you an update on the status.
Brian Heinrichs, Mayor's Office. So Mayor's correct. We're hopeful to have that contract with the Washington Street Resolution Center this week. It's in purchasing's domain right now. And the Mayor's correct. You'll all recall that the WDRC moved offices towards the end of last year. And that certainly contributed to a little bit of a delay. And as we spoke, I think it was maybe a couple weeks ago, as part of the 1920 budget, that's when we had the budget authority to move forward. So I had a chance to speak with Moonwater briefly this morning. We're still on track. They've been doing some work in preparation for the completion of the contract. That's the last sort of piece to put together, and expect that once that is in place, the program itself will continue to move that forward.
Thank you, Brian. And
Can
so,
I-
yeah, go ahead, Mayor.
Oh, no, I was just going to answer the rest of the questions briefly, unless you have something else you want me to address.
No, I was just going to follow up to Brian's comment then. If this committee or the committee of the whole, like how the council and the public will be notified when the rubber hits the road and when that's open for business.
Yeah, good question. So we'll be putting together a communication plan in concert with the WDRC. They have networks that they can use, and I think Pinky's point's a good one with respect to the communications team that we have at the city. We can use our channels to announce that, and we'll also need to have some signage or some sort of an effort. I'm envisioning at like our front line staff have the ability to direct folks to that resource when it's available. So we'll use, a combination of those types of mediums to get out to folks.
Secondly, the communication. We have been stressing more Facebook, social media. We have a communication, a citywide now communication. Vanessa's been training people in each department because part of it is what we get to transmit. So if we don't have the information to transmit, we can't transmit it to the public. And making sure that Vanessa or the communication director is aware of what's going out from the department. So we always can make improvements in that, and I agree with you because I think social media, while I'm not the social media queen, I think everybody else is. So I will follow up with Vanessa again and explain this to her because I think you've brought it up before. We've talked about it before. I know she was aware that we needed to do that. But we also need to know from the police, we had an ICE activity, whatever we'd like to let the public know and who's going to do that, whether it's in-house police or citywide or whatever. But we have to have the internal communication also. And then just the last thing is, and this is the piece that I have stressed to both our police officers and others, is we don't enforce immigration law over here by itself. Now, Peter just brought up if it says this and it's trafficking, of course, we're going to protect children. But as far as just stopping someone and asking them their immigration status, or if there is a concern, asking someone their immigration status, if you find out we're doing that, someone better let me know, because we are not, the direction is we are not doing that. So I just want to be clear with you that there's no, not trying to get around that.
And so that, obviously that's what the community wants to hear, and then being able to keep promises like that in check are really dependent upon the community coming forward and filing complaints. And so I think that's why it's so critical that this move forward sooner rather than later, that we continue on that course to have, and this may not be the be-all, end-all answer, right, through the Watkins Dispute Resolution Center, but having different avenues for people to come forward in spaces where they feel safe. Because labeling this sort of a safe space, it's like, well, we might say it's safe and we feel like it's safe, but if the people who need that resource and need that door to be open don't feel safe going to that space, then we're not doing our job fully, right? But so needing people to trust that process and come forward.
Well, and I was very clear that this was an important thing for me at the beginning of this whole thing. It wasn't something that I was, led kicking and screaming to do. The other part is, I think it's important for those who might be unhappy with how we're doing it to also know, if the administration wants to know whether they feel comfortable coming to us or going to dispute resolution or doing an omnibus or whatever, might happen in the future, that there is us continuing to say that the position of the city is that you don't have to be afraid to come to me and say there's a police officer or anyone who has violated my rights. That's a difficult thing for an elected official to know, but I understand, which is why we're going this other route.
April?
I think there's a real chance to build partnership and collaboration and efficacy in the process that Brian was talking about with rolling out the safe spaces. He did touch on all of the standard typical ones, but knowing different communities across here, not all the time that filters all the way down. And we have wonderful partners in this community with community to community, the Bellingham school districts and their family engagement, that really would, if you went specifically to them to say, you know, we're really looking for, and spin it, you know, it's not about, it's really looking for help to make sure we're doing exactly what we said we're going to do, and then reaching out into the populations where people are talking to them to make sure that they know about it. So I appreciate that you talked about all kind of our typical ways of going about it, but I would appreciate if we would, if you would work with staff to really focus in on those people who have access into those communities to make sure that that's expressed and they know where they can go and seek that. Because I just think that those are great opportunities for us to start building that collaboration and partnership.
Councilmember Vargas?
I was just going to take what April just said, and maybe that's something that we could ask Monet to do, is once that contract is open, to communicate with all of these agencies and let them know that the service is out there, so that we can start building the awareness so people know that it's available, and then we can start figuring out how large the need is for that communication.
Hannah, can I respond to that, please?
Yes, ma'am.
I think that's a great idea. We need to use every opportunity to put things out there. It is the city's responsibility to do it, though, also. So as we're doing with Western students, we knew that they were uncomfortable reporting their rental registration. You know, they didn't feel comfortable because of the potential unintended consequence of them reporting something. So I'm working with Chris Roselli at Western to say, can the university be a receptacle for the students so that they don't have to feel like they have to challenge their landlord when something happens. I think we can do that on this also, but it really does take all of us, and someone might feel much more comfortable telling community to community what they think, and my door has always been open for that information. Now, we had some disputes about what an oversight board should look like and things like that, but that has nothing to do with protecting people's safety in reporting things that are going on. So, so I think that's great, Pinky. Monet can do a great job with all that, but we bear some responsibility.
Did the committee have anything else?
Yeah, and just because we're winding down, originally you had started out with discussing some of the internal policies that are subject to administration and the chief of police. And it sounded like y'all are reviewing those again, so that might be a great opportunity to come back and have a future agenda item that, one, as they're doing those themselves, but if there's any more questions from this committee that they might be able to look at, like such as what you brought up. So maybe as the chair, you could follow up with that. That'd be great.
Absolutely. Okay. Councilmember Lillquist?
Yes, thank you for allowing me to speak. First, I want to speak to something which just came up, which has to do with using Welcome Dispute Resolution Center to create a safe spaces. As you said, Hannah, they're not the be-all, end-all. We know this because they told us that. We were delivered a report which indicated that there was a certain key function which they were unsuited to deliver. And so I'm afraid it'll be misleading if we say we've created a solution to that problem, because that solution will be least capable when it's most needed, when there's the worst kind of allegation that needs to be taken seriously is the one case where dispute resolution centers services won't be appropriate. I still think we need something like an ombudsman's function in addition. That's one thing I wanted to mention. And the other thing, if you don't mind, it has to do with one of the things when this draft ordinance came forward the first time that I asked for before it was developed and it wasn't in there, and I think it's one way it could be strengthened, is even though we say we don't intentionally ask or inquire or investigate, there's certainly opportunity that city employees, law enforcement will become incidentally aware of someone's immigration status. That's maybe fine, but that should not be recorded. Because if we record in our records that information, then that information is discoverable in a way we don't want it to be discovered. Even though we say we're not going to share it, if we create it it is discoverable, potentially we can be compelled to share it. So I think we could strengthen this among a couple ways by adding in language to avoid that incidental recording of information which we do not have any need to record, which may put people at risk, the people we're trying to protect. So I think there's an opportunity there.
Thank you. So committee is out of time today, but basically the beginning of a conversation and obviously, the work that will be going forward. But for now, I just want to thank everyone for their time and we'll follow up. Okay, thank you. End of committee.